Adho Mukha Svanasana. Adho Mukha Svanasana. We are learning downward facing dog. It's Claire from the Yoga Chapel. Welcome to Spring 20 to Life. Let's get into it. We're going to just start seated, warming up our wrists. Oh, did I mention it's downward facing dog? That's what it is. So we're going to warm up our wrists, kind of rotating them in one direction and then the opposite direction. Bring your hands together and just moving them from left to right. And sometimes your forearms can get really sore starting with downward facing dog. Same with your wrists. So it feels like you're pushing all the weight onto your wrists. So really pay attention and give a lot of love to your wrists. And always come down onto your knees if it becomes too much. Okay? So stretching out your fingers and hands, rotating again. Let's just do a few more to the left and then a few more to the right. Okay, let's come into a tabletop position to warm up the spine. We're going to stack our hands or our palms underneath our shoulders, feet width distance apart, pushing our feet into the floor, hands deep into the mat. And you want to kind of equal pressure on your hands as well as your knees. And that's going to be a later cue when Joan comes into downward facing dog. Having equal weight. Belly button to spine and just look down at your mat. Let's do 3 rounds of cat-cow. Inhaling our belly down, chest coming forward, looking up, cow. Exhale, rounding through our spine, dropping our head heavy, looking at our legs, cat. 2 more just like that. Back to a neutral spine. Coming on to our knees, child's pose position. Stretching your arms long, tending those fingertips, dropping the forehead to the floor. And keeping the engagement with the arms. So pushing through those fingertips, arms pulling away, forehead pushing deep into the mat if possible. And then release your arms back down to the mat. Relaxing through the shoulders, head deeper into the mat, hips releasing. Moving through the hands, taking yourself back to that tabletop position. Let's do thread the needle. Bringing the right hand to the right, thread it underneath the left, dropping onto that right shoulder, tending the left fingertips, and pause. Push through the left hand to take you back to that tabletop position. Move through a round of cat-cow, dropping the belly, look up. Exhale, rounding through the spine. Neutral through the spine. Left arm comes out beside you, threading it underneath the right. Pausing on your right shoulder, tenting the fingertips. Planting through that right hand, pushing your way back to that tabletop position. 1 round of cat-cow. Inhaling your belly down. Exhale, rounding through the spine. Bring your knees out wider to your mat. Back to a child's pose, tenting those fingertips. Drop the forehead down. If you can, we're going to do thread the needle in a child's pose position. If that's too much, coming back to a tabletop. Otherwise, moving your hand to the right, threading it underneath your left, really scooching onto that right shoulder, and then releasing the left hand down. Inhale brings you back to center through that one wide-legged child's pose, dropping the forehead. Just take a pause. Looking forward, bring the left arm out to the side, threaded underneath the right, dropping onto the left shoulder, releasing the right arm. Planting through the right hand, stretch both arms forward, maybe dropping the forehead a little bit closer to the mat. Slowly make your way back to that tabletop position. And let's do one more round of cat-cow. Inhaling your belly down. Exhale, rounding through the spine. And this time coming back onto our shins. Then we're going to get Joan in to take us through a full round of our downward facing dog and little tips and tricks.
Thanks, Claire. That was awesome. A perfect little warm-up before we start our downward dog little tutorial. And we've left downward dog kind of right at the end because it actually is a really advanced position, even though it's used all the time in kind of every sequence or every image that you see of yoga. Downward dog is there. Downward dog is actually way trickier than I think people realize. So know that. Know if you're struggling with downward dog, that's normal because it's not a beginner position. It's more of an intermediate position, I would say, for so many reasons.
Or a resting position?
Eventually, downward dog becomes a resting position, but this happens over a long time. Remember, we're trying to progress within our own ranges of our own body, right? And so I know that downward dog has kind of eluded me for a while, and then there was the aha moments because we do it all the time. But I want you to do it really safely because there is elements of the pose that can, over periods of time, if you're doing it kind of incorrectly, is not great for the body. And this is particular of the low back. Okay, so the low back, and if we have low back issues, it can be because our back of our legs or hamstrings are tight. And we've talked about this in previous classes. We have sedentary or seated lives. COVID has caused a lot of that to happen, but a lot of us have these jobs where we sit a lot. That can be detrimental a little bit for our body. Saying that, downward dog is an amazing pose to help counteract that seated position. But we have to kind of get there. Two things before we get into the flow is our hand position is going to be really important. We want to spread the hands wide. And why that's a big cue in downward facing dog and any basically hand positioning is, my Band-Aid, is because we want as much surface area as we can. So if we're little surface area, we're gonna not use as much space, right? We wanna take up space with our palms. A nice image that I kind of think about sometimes is those like sticky hand frogs, right? We want our hands glued so that the hands are really powerful. That's one thing. The second thing is we need to breathe and be upside down. That can be really tricky. So if you have to come out of downward dog and come into tabletop, that is always an option, and I'll show you what that option is. When we talk about the palm, I want you to imagine that little space between the index and the thumb. That's all I want you to think about in this class. And I want you to stick that down. So if you're sitting on the floor right now and meeting us, you're gonna put your palm down, the left one, and you're gonna think all of your energy is gonna stick that space between the index and thumb down. You're spreading the fingertips wide. They're growing from your hand out. So you're rooting through your hands. Your hands are going to take a lot of work when we first start in downward facing dog. Just natural. The shoulders want to take over and the legs don't work as much as they should. But we're going to combat that as well. So let's just get right into it. Claire's gonna come back to a child's pose. This is a perfect start for our downward facing dog. And if you need to look at the screen is always there to give you assistance. You're going to extend the arms really, really long. Long meaning the elbows are going to extend. You're going to spread the fingertips super wide. You're going to plant the hands down. So it's not a passive pose. We're using it as an active position. Shoulders pull away from the ears, so there's a traction back, and then the hips drop closer towards the heels. Okay. Now the forehead might be able to touch down to the floor. It doesn't, don't worry. I want you to keep those extended arms. So arms are long, pulling further and further and further away from the body. Okay. Now without adjusting the hands, you're going to take an inhale and come up into a tabletop position. Good. Hold that. Now you won't be stacked. Shoulders won't be stacked over wrists. Don't worry about that. But I want you to pull the knees in, hip width distance apart, and separate the feet so they're hip width distance apart. So you might make it a little bit adjustment with the bottom of your legs. Okay. Take an inhale, come into cow spine. So the pelvis is going to tilt up and Claire's going to look forward. Okay. You're going to pause. So the arms are fully extended. So the elbows are extended. You're in a cow tilt, which I'm going to start calling it a downward dog tilt of the spine, because this is what we want to keep our spine as we come into the full pose. Good. Take a breath and take a breath out. Good. You're going to keep the head exactly where it is. You're going to keep the spine the way it is. You're going to keep the arms the way they are. You're going to tuck the toes under. You're going to push through the hands and pull the hips back, like you're going to come back into a child's pose. Good. Now from there, where the hips are pulled as far back as they can towards the heels, you're going to lift the hips up. Yes. Now see how bent the knees are? I want to keep the knees bent, the heels lifted. Good. Keep the eyes forward. Good. Come back to that downward dog tilt the best you can. Extend through the arms, pressure through the hands. Let the head fall between the arms, and then start to straighten the legs the best you can. Now, Claire's heels are not going to touch the floor, and that is perfectly fine, right? But we want to have equal pressure through those toes or the feet that's hitting the ground, as much of the foot as you can. You're going to keep the knees slightly bent. Okay, extend through the arms. Let the shoulders pull away from the ears. Lock that space between the index and thumb. Take a deep breath in into the belly and a long breath out. Now you're in an inversion. So if you're used to breathing in and out through the nose and that becomes strenuous in this position, that's totally normal. Breathe in and out through the mouth until you can recapture the breath. All right. Let's slowly look forward, soften the knees as come back down into that tabletop position. Yes. Okay, so untucking the toes. Now shoulders are stacked over the wrist. Let's keep the eyes looking down towards the floor. Good, pull belly up and towards spine. So we have this long spine or long line from shoulder to hip. That was a perfect downward dog. Doesn't have to be bigger or more exaggerated than that. Okay, let's come back into our second set. Spread the fingertips as wide. Extend through the arms, so the arms are long without locking out the elbows. That's tricky. Here's where we're going to start to change that perception. So before we go back to downward facing dog, you're going to look at the screen just for a second. You're going to imagine, and then I'm going to push on the outside of Claire's biceps or her arms, and she's going to push against them, right? See how her elbows want to bend? But I'm going to try to keep that. She's going to try to keep them extended, like you have a strap wrapped around your biceps. That's the pressure I want you to feel through the arms, right? So that's going to help keep out, especially if you lock your elbows, if you feel like you're hyperextended through the arms, that might help keep you engaged so it's strong when we come back up and you're not locking into your joints. Okay, so let's come back to our point of lock, which is between the thumb and the index finger. Extend through the arms. Imagine you have a strap wrapped around the biceps. Tuck the toes. Downward cow tilt or downward dog tilt. Good. Then looking forward, keep the eyes forward. Pull the hips back towards the heels like you're coming into a child's pose. Then pull the hips up as you straighten the legs. Good. And keeping the head facing forward, keeping that downward dog tilt. Good. Let's lift through the hips and then start to extend through the legs and then start to drop the heels. Good. Now Claire's lost a little bit of her spine, so she's going to rebend her knees. She's going to pull her hips back, keep the length of the spine, and then hold that position. Good. Let's take a breath, shoulders out of the ears, extend through the arms. So there's that powerful V position with the body. And fully exhale all the way out. Okay, let's take a pause. Let's come down onto our knees, taking a child's pose, either knees together, knees separated. Let the elbows relax and turn the palms up. So as we start to learn downward facing dog, the wrists are going to be a little sore because the body is taking too much weight on the wrists. We're going to try to rectify that, but know that it takes a little bit of time. Okay, let's take one more breath in. Let's take another breath out. We're going to come into our third set of downward facing dog. We're not going to straighten the legs. We're going to keep them bent. And straighten the arms again, so we're working that position. So work the arms as far away from the body as you can. Plant through the hands. Think about that frog sticking its whole palm onto the glass or onto the floor. Lock into that space between the index and thumb. Good. Then slowly come up into that modified tabletop. So you might not be completely stacked. Tilt the pelvis. Bring the knees hip-width distance in. Feet hip-width distance apart. So downward dog tilt. You're going to tuck the toes. Pull the hips back to the heels. Good. Now slowly let the head fall between the arms. Keep the arms extended. You're going to pull the hips back and up. So straighten the legs. Good. Keep the knees bent. Walk the feet mat-width distance apart. This will ease off your pose. Remember, you can always take this wide-legged version. Good. Now, if I stand at the back and you can watch just a little bit towards your side, I'm going to pull up from the hips. Good. And then pull the hips back towards you. And see if you can straighten them as much as you can. Now, your hamstrings are going to give you a little bit of a show here. And if they're really tight, your spine is going to round. We don't want the spine to round. We want to keep that downward dog tilt, so bend the knees, lift the heels, and then lift the hips straight up. So downward dog gives you a shape of a pyramid or a triangle, right? And your hips are that midline coming up towards the ceiling. Equal pressure through the hands into the feet or hands through the toes. Now, if I was in class with you, a nice adjustment is like pushing the bum up and then pushing slightly forward and down, right? So you get this sense that you can kind of float those hands off the ground. You want more energy to pull through the back of the legs. It's a really nice stretch through the arms. We have two lines of energy. Hands up towards the hip, hip down towards the heels, and we want them even eventually. Now, if you're really tight and you find that you're doming in the back and downward dog is dumping all the weight into the hands, you're going to bend the knees, you're going to lift the heels, and you're going to think about lifting the hips straight up. Don't think about them back. Think about lifting them up. Don't think about straight legs even. This is a perfect downward facing dog. And then slowly come down. Let's take a child's pose together to take a breather. Relax the arms, relax the wrist, relax the hands, taking breaths in and out. Okay. And let's slowly come up to a seated position. Downward dog, as you can see, even if you've done it a long time, can be really tricky. There's a lot of elements to that. We're trying to have extension through our arms and our wrists. We're trying to put pressure through our hands and equally through our feet. But the big key thing is we're in an inversion. An inversion means that your head is lower than your heart, which can cause a lot of things to happen. And I want you to be really gentle with your body. If you feel that you're out of breath, you feel dizzy, you always come out. Right? Always take a child's pose, always take a downward facing dog or a tabletop position. Equally great poses. So that's being said. But do try and practice. Practice all those little elements being put together. What do you feel is not stretched or wide? And see if you can widen it and see if that range of motion opens up for you. Yeah? Okay. Let's bring our elbows to touch, interlock the hands. You're going to try to keep the hands together and make circular motions with the wrists. This is where it gets really crispity-crunchity for me, but I feel like it's such a nice way to kind of roll out any of that tension. And you're going to come back to center, and you're going to interlock the hands the opposite direction and move the wrist from the left. So the left hand moving the right around. Try to keep the elbows tight together. That does help create a little bit more fluid and mobility through the wrist. All right, and then let's come off that and let's just shake it off. So imagine the hands are noodles and away from the body. And we're trying to get some of that tension out, like you're wringing off water off of your body. So let's use our left hand on the right and sweep. And let's use the left hand and sweep all that energy off and away. Good. So last thing, let's kind of have Claire come back into a tabletop position. Another wrist stretch using a little bit of force. Fingertips are facing forward. So you're going to tuck the toes, and you're going to rock back and forth. Just to where your edges are. So shoulders behind the wrist, shoulders beyond the wrist. And this will make more sense in the next couple of classes as we come into the flow. And then pull it back, pull it forward. Good. Then she's going to come back to tabletop, or you're going to come back to tabletop. Turn the fingertips out to the right and to the left. So the fingertips are on the sides, and you're going to sway back and forth to the right and to the left. Keep those fingertips as wide as you can. Good. All right. And so the last little bit, as you come back through center, see if you can bring your fingertips to face possibly the knees. Now, Claire has a lot of range of motion in her wrist. This is no problem for her. That might not be the same for you. Please don't stress out. That just means the anatomy of your body. So any gradation from the right, showing you from the center view, any gradation, fingertips face forward away from the knees, to the side, right? To the side, to the back, further to the back, right? So anywhere in that semicircle from the front to the back. And you're just going to rest, spreading the fans, and maybe tuck the toes and pull the hips back. You're trying to keep the heels of the hands on the ground. That's where we'll get the real nice stretch through the forearms. Okay. Come back if you pulled back, and let's unwind the hands so they face forward. Good. And then we'll come into a nice, quick seated position as I direct Claire through a twist. Coming down onto the bum, taking the legs out long. Good. Bringing the legs a little closer together. Let's take the right foot over the left. Tent the fingertips as you lift the chest. Summertime feet. That's what I say. Okay, lifting the left arm all the way up, breath in. Exhale, the left elbow to the outside of the right arm. Claire's gonna wrap, so that's another version. You're trying to bring the leg a little closer towards the body. Take another breath in. Remember, inhale, extend through the spine. Exhale, twist. Try to pull that left shoulder, or try to pull the left ribs to the right ribs. And then maybe the chin towards the shoulder, coming into the cervical spine. Really nice. Remember that right hip pulling forward, not letting the left hip come with you. Take a breath in. Exhale on the breath out. We're going to come back through center. Good. We're going to tent the fingertips onto the outside, the left side, and come into another twist. Let's unwind. Let's bring the right foot forward. Let's cross the left up and over. Lift the left arm all the way up. Exhale, take the elbow to the outside of the left thigh. Take a breath in. Exhale and twist. Good. Claire's going to stay wrapped, squared through the hips, even through the foot, which I've noticed, toe in line with heel. Good. And then start to bring the left ribs to the right ribs, and as the right ribs pull back behind you, then add the neck involved, chin toward shoulder. Really good. Nice. So these are little things that you can pick up on your own body, kind of wringing out your abdominals. Breath in. Breath out. Let's slowly come all the way back. Keep the legs as they are. Tent the fingertips over to the right and fall into the right side. Don't worry about your hip lifting. You're just counter twisting on this other side. Good. And then we'll come right onto our back. We'll enjoy a 5-minute meditation together, which I think is really important before we move into our kind of final days together, which is kind of exciting. And it's been a pleasure teaching you so far. This pose might feel the best for you, knees together, feet hip-width distance apart. Let's turn the palms up, moving the hands a little further away from your body. Really find that space. And if your lower back is in any tension, this might feel better than a Shavasana. Or allow the body to come into a Shavasana, taking the legs out long, even wider than the mat. That's what I want you to start to work for. Toes start to flop out. Good. Relaxing through the legs, relaxing through the face. I'm going to get out a shot and let you enjoy your Shavasana. Staying here as long as you need. And from Claire and from me at the Yoga Chapel, we wish you an amazing rest of your evening or into your day. Namaste.